Hi, thanks for tuning in. My name's Deepan, and I'm going to be talking about why an ounce of validation is worth a pound of pivot. Starting a PM role can feel like a trial by fire. You're expected to figure out what to build, why to build it, and then coordinate many people across many disciplines to ensure success, all without formal authority and in the face of a lot of ambiguity. Even when you've narrowed down a problem space to a smaller set of options, how do you know you're making the right choice? And after that, how do you convince everyone else that it's the right choice? I grappled with these questions when I first became a PM at a company called LiveRamp, and I still tackle these questions almost every day at my current job as a PM at LinkedIn. LiveRamp and LinkedIn are very different companies. The former is a B2B ad tech company, and when I joined, it had about 180 employees. The products I worked on were fairly technical, data pipelines and identity graphs. LinkedIn, on the other hand, has over 16,000 employees, and I work on the messaging product, which is in front of millions of users per day. Despite that, I've been served well by a fairly consistent set of principles for validating projects, and over time have become better at using them to make good decisions and communicate them to others. During this talk, there are a few major areas I'm going to talk about. First, I'll briefly define validation and discuss why it's essential for product management. Second, I'll talk about the three main dimensions you should try to validate for every project and the principles behind them. Finally, I'll share a few strategies for validating each component in different scenarios. Interspersed throughout will be an example from my own experience. By the end of this talk, I hope you'll be equipped to avoid some of the mistakes I've made in the past, and hopefully even learn a few concrete strategies I picked up on the way. Let's jump right in. What is validation exactly? I see it as answering the question, is this bet worth making, as quickly and cheaply as possible? The idea is not to eliminate uncertainty, but to manage it. A good bet is never a sure thing, but you always want the odds in your favor. If you can get from less than 50% confidence to 70% by doing some due diligence, why wouldn't you? The other part of that question is implied, but just as important. Is this bet worth making compared to all the other bets we can make? As a PM, you'll usually need to decide between many possible options. Validation can provide both a standard of comparison you can use when deciding between them, and a powerful tool to persuade stakeholders. Now, validation is also important because of the consequences of neglecting it. As a PM, you're trying to ensure your organization's limited resources are being leveraged as effectively as possible. Having to pivot or abandon a project halfway leads to costly context switching, organizational whiplash, and decreased trust from your team. Worst of all is building something that no one ended up using and not knowing why. Validation isn't a magic bullet. Even the most watertight projection can sink in the real world, but it'll help you recognize and steer clear of a lot of avoidable mistakes. And when worst comes to worst, it'll at least make it easier to diagnose why something failed. At LiveRamp, my team was in charge of maintaining, extending, and improving the performance of data pipelines and the UX that customers used to interact with it. We were considering whether it would make sense to expose a stable public API so that companies could access our pipelines programmatically. Throughout the next part of this talk, I'll discuss how I ended up validating this idea and what decision we ended up making. There are generally three main dimensions that PMs should consider when validating different options. In order of importance, they are the story, the impact, and the cost. Once you have these for a project, you can build a framework to better understand how good of a bet you're making. First, let's talk about the story. Here you're confirming you're actually solving a problem your users even care about. Does the narrative around this project make sense? Does it fit in with your organization's vision and strategy? It may seem simple, but this can be an easy thing to lose sight of when you have KPIs to hit or inherit projects. This is arguably the most important thing to validate and serves as a counterbalance to the other two components. If a project is expected to be a needle mover for some important KPIs, but it doesn't seem to be solving a real user problem, then that should be a warning flag. In our API example from before, I first validated whether API-enabled programmatic access was solving an actual user problem by speaking to many of our customers, as well as several sales reps and some of our business development people. I found that many of our largest customers' biggest pain point was the amount of manual management our product required, which slowed them down and didn't take full advantage of their sophisticated technical capabilities. I also found that an entirely new line of business could be unlocked by API capabilities. In fact, several clients had already reached out and signaled they were interested, and it was the biggest reason they hadn't signed already. API-enabled programmatic access and faster time to market of new workflows was also strongly aligned with our product strategy at the time, which was focused on extensibility and automation. So I knew that I'd likely have buy-in from most internal stakeholders as well. Second, let's talk about the impact. When validating impact, you're trying to understand to what extent you're furthering your organization's goals. Most of the time, goals are measured using a key metric or a set of key metrics. These can vary wildly across organizations, products, and even teams. Validating impact usually involves using past data, research, and some intuition to project how a particular project will move the needle on those metrics. Often, the assumptions that go into a projection can be just as important as the final estimate itself. This is because they can give you important insight into the upside potential of your estimate. A common example is TAM, or total addressable market. When two projects have similar overall impact estimates, but one has a much higher TAM, that one may have higher upside potential and may be a better bet. Coming back to our API, after validating that it was solving real problems and it was aligned with our strategy, I did a basic impact analysis by projecting some of the following. First, I looked at increased usage by our biggest accounts after they switched to API management, based on new use cases they wanted to enable. I also estimated future contract value from unlocking new lines of business. So the impact, were we to release a stable API, was likely to be high based on that analysis. Finally, the cost. This encompasses not only monetary costs, but overall complexity and the effort and time required to complete a project. When a project is resource or time intensive, it can reduce its overall value, especially when compared to cheaper options. An important, but sometimes esoteric part of cost validation involves measuring complexity. More complex projects involve more unknown unknowns and more uncertainty. Projects can be complex because they have requirements of new or unfamiliar technology, they have tons of dependencies or interactions, or simply because they have massive scope. It's usually very difficult to quantitatively measure complexity, and it's very unlikely that you, as a PM, will be able to accurately get a handle on it alone. It's important to lean on your partner teams, especially engineering and design, who will have a much deeper understanding of how complex a project is and why. Measuring the cost of building the API was complex, but we approached it in a methodical way. We first explored our technical options at a high level and realized we could take one of two basic approaches. Either we build it the right way, which would imply building a brand new API on top of new, clean, modularized pieces, or we could shore up the collection of prototype APIs on top of our existing workflows and then put in some work to tie them all together and make sure they could scale. I worked with engineering to better understand the cost of each of these two options. For option one, we realized that the cost would be very high. Not only would it take a ton of engineering effort to build everything, including the components and the new workflows, there were tons of dependencies with other teams and systems, which added a lot of complexity and coordination time. And this would require a lot of new and unfamiliar technology as well. For option two, we found that the cost would still be medium, as there would be quite a lot of engineering effort required. However, this option built on top of existing familiar workflows rather than requiring them to be rewritten, which eliminated a ton of dependency and uncertainty and required less new technology. There are many frameworks that help contextualize and utilize these validation dimensions at different levels of detail, including Agile, which uses story points and business value. A quick and dirty one that I like to use treats story as a yes-no hypothesis and then plots impact versus cost in order to find the biggest bang for your buck. Generally, we're trying to maximize impact and minimize cost. Going back to our API example, at the point we left off, we had two options to decide between. Since they each resulted in a different feature set, I actually went back and revalidated each option's story and impact based on this new info. Option 1 is a fully formed, super flexible API best fit the story. It is an elegant solution to pretty much all of our customers' asks. It was extremely future-proof and allowed us to mix and match system components in the future to spin up new custom workflows. Option 2 was still a huge step forward. If we built it correctly, it would solve for the biggest pain points for most of our customers and enable a basic integration with new business verticals, but without any customization. They both still passed the story check, so now it was a matter of comparing their impacts versus their costs. Since it's more important to represent relative differences between options rather than individual estimates, we can plot them on the same matrix. Here we see that although the full API, option 1, has higher impact, its much higher cost makes the incremental API, option 2, a more compelling bet. This is because we unlock similar impact more quickly and with more confidence, and it can even serve as a validation for further investment into the full API later down the road. Now, a quick note on quick wins. Using this matrix too religiously can incentivize them to the exclusion of everything else. There are times when it's worth betting on high impact, high cost, strategic wins. And that's when the story is extremely powerful. When a project or idea has an extremely compelling story that can supercharge your organization's mission or even alter its course, it can absolutely be worth betting on. A balanced product strategy usually incorporates bets with varying levels of impact and cost. Now, before I talk about specific strategies, I want to mention one important caveat. Before you do validation, you must ensure you understand your organization's mission, its underlying goals, and the problem space you're working in very deeply. Until you do that, you're basically shooting in the dark. Validation can help you prioritize a list of possible solutions, but it's less helpful for coming up with ideas in the first place. So going back to our agenda, as we said before, when validating story, there are two things we want to pay attention to. Is this a problem that you just care about? And does this fit in with the overall vision and strategy of your organization? When first trying to answer question 1, there are several ways you can begin validating using user research. First is customer interviews, surveys, and studies into how users currently use your product or how they use prototypes or mockups. Depending on the size of your organization, there may be teams devoted to user research that you can partner with. This can be invaluable, but it's extremely important that you don't outsource it completely. As a PM, actually speaking to customers yourself and hearing directly from them is irreplaceable. After you've narrowed the field down to a few high potential bets, it can be worth building lo-fi prototypes of MVPs to do even more in-depth validation. This is especially useful when all of the best bets are likely to have very high cost. This lets you be extra sure that the impact will be worth it. The goal of a lo-fi prototype is to gauge interest and demand out in the wild when the project in question is competing against everything else potential users are worrying and thinking about, which isn't always the case when you're interviewing them. Two common strategies for this include fake landing pages or sign-up lists to gauge demand, and Wizard of Oz tests, which basically have someone behind the curtain who's actually performing any work that needs to be done using no-code tools like Google Sheets, Airtable, etc. This lets you gauge how your users are interacting with it. Now, when it comes to strategy and whether it aligns with vision, it's usually a lot more straightforward to figure out if your project fits. But it can be useful to pitch it to a few stakeholders to get a set of second opinions and just do a sanity check. This type of validation can also vary a lot at different scales and different business models. B2B businesses like LiveRamp often have fewer customers, but each is relatively more important. With dedication and time, you can realistically speak to almost all of them, or at least a very representative sample, and directly ask deep questions about potential products and their underlying motivations or goals. B2C businesses, like the LinkedIn flagship site, generally have far too many users to realistically interview even a representative sample. So scalable tools like surveys and even lo-fi prototypes can often be more useful because they can be done at scale. Strategies for validating impact can also vary between very data-driven companies and those that have little tracking and experimentation infrastructure, where data can be difficult to access. For the more data-rich companies, when there's a ton of data available, impact validation becomes relatively straightforward. You're generally trying to project the impact that a project will have on your team's key metrics and guardrails. Usually you can take advantage of past similar experiments and changes to help model impact. You can even use current analogous user flows to try to do the same thing. Generally, you can set up a funnel analysis to get from your TAM to the specific impact you're looking for in a project. In some organizations, there may be teams or individuals like BizOps who you can collaborate with to do impact sizing. You also want to have a basic understanding of the possible negative impacts of a change. For example, redirecting traffic from another page or causing less usage of a similar feature. As an example, this is usually the type of validation I do at my job right now. LinkedIn has a very data-driven, experimentation-heavy culture, and there is often some past experiment or feature change I can dig up reports for, and then use them to do sizing. I'm also lucky to have truly incredible BizOps, data science, and product marketing partners who live and breathe metrics, analysis, and research. They make it a lot easier. Now, when your organization has very little tracking or experimentation infrastructure and a lack of past data to lean on, there are other strategies you can use to estimate impact. For example, approximate time spent completing a task can be translated to monetary cost. For projects to improve internal processes, you can convert time spent to cost based on the all-in hourly rate of your success or product ops reps. For projects to improve external workflows, you can attempt to convert efficiency into revenue. For example, automating workflow X will decrease setup time by 50%. This could lead to 30% more setups being completed, and then revenue could be impacted by Y%. Time spent can be collected using surveys or informal interviews and then generalizing. Often the teams that spend the most time interacting with users will be your best friends here, as they'll have the deepest understanding of what your customers care about and what they spend the most time on. Another strategy you can use is to set your own baseline by manually recording and collecting data over a period of time, and then estimating what impact various improvements can have. This is the type of validation I generally ended up doing at LiveRamp, which was at the time much smaller and just getting started to ramp up a more robust tracking infrastructure. When I couldn't pull raw data myself, I'd often approximate impact after talking to as many relevant customers and teammates as possible. Validating costs is usually a very collaborative and iterative process. You'll need to lean on teams and individuals with experience and expertise to help estimate cost, complexity, and effort, and those estimates will likely need to be refined as scope becomes more clear. There are many main contributors to cost, and some of the main ones that I want to talk about are engineering effort, dependencies on other teams, the size of a footprint, which is how many parts of a system you might be touching, money spent if you're spending money on contractors, marketing, hiring, acquiring customers, migrations, system scalability and capacity, especially if it's not yet scaled and you need to add additional capacity, and then new and unfamiliar tech. And while it's important to consider each of these things, it's usually more practical to roll them up into a single measure of effort when comparing different projects. When a project has really huge or undefined scope, it can be really difficult to estimate cost. When this is the case, it's usually necessary to break it into smaller, better defined chunks and then validate each chunk separately. Ideally, each chunk independently delivers its own value, although that's not always possible. And because cost has many components, it can be easy to overlook one or more of them. Sometimes this isn't an issue, but often it's the difference between a successful product and one that fails to launch. When I first started as a PM, my team and I decided to take an extremely ambitious project. The story was game-changing for many of our stakeholders, the impact was sky high, and the cost was high, but seemed manageable. But Because of the amount of excitement from those stakeholders and the massive scope of the project, we ended up overlooking its many, many dependencies, its brand new technologies, some massive data migrations, and its at the time unsupported hardware requirements. As you can imagine, the project kept ballooning in size and scope as we ran into one problem after another until eventually we had to abandon it entirely. We learned valuable lessons and were able to chalk up a few incidental ones on the way. But if we'd been a bit more thorough while validating cost and broken it up into more manageable chunks, we could have saved a lot of time and heartbreak. For example, one final related note. When it comes to validation, saying no is just as important, if not more important, than saying yes. One of the biggest mistakes that PMs make, especially early on in their careers, is not saying no enough. I still do this. If you validate it diligently, you should feel empowered to push back against projects that, for example, don't have high enough impact or have extremely high cost relative to other possible options, because you should have data analysis to back it up after you validate it. As a quick review, here are the key takeaways. Validation attempts to answer the question, is this bet worth making, as quickly and cheaply as possible? Neglecting validation can lead to context switching, whiplash, and decreased trust. The three main dimensions to consider when validating different options are the story, the impact, and the cost, in that order. Every project should have a compelling story. And at a high level, your strategy when making bets should usually maximize impact while minimizing cost. An exception, though, is when a story is particularly powerful. I hope this helps ease your journeys through product management, that you all can avoid some of the mistakes I made along the way. Thank you, and happy validating.